Hello, Bravs. We're back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, Major General Frank Richardson, MD. We pick up at Chapter 3, Some Psychological Influences. The contempt which Napoleon expressed for medical theories, which seemed to him to lack scientific proof, would certainly have been extended to psychological theorization. The secrets of the mind cannot be dissected or explained by exact scientific methods, such as those which commended to Napoleon the study of anatomy. He would have given short shrift to Dr. Ivan or any other doctor had they attempted to explain to him the mechanism by which his mind could have produced the physical state. And he would surely have resented as an impertinence any attempt to probe the secrets of his mind. Even now I feel it to be somewhat impertinent to try to confine his overwhelming and many-sided personality within the framework of any psychological category. Jacques Bainville's opinion that Napoleon's personality is too elusive to be captured in any psychological portrait might deter anyone from attempting the impossible, but I think that previous attempts to psychoanalyze Napoleon may have failed because of the omission of a very important prelude to a psychological diagnosis, which is a thorough physical examination. I, at least, have not been guilty of that omission, and the broad outlines which my portrait will take can be deduced from the significant facts which I have related, pointing to a physical disability in the genital system. But although the sexual factor often has a profound effect upon the individual's behavior and the development of his character and personality, it should never be the only aspect of his life to which a psychiatrist's attention is directed. In this chapter, without attempting to fit Napoleon into any specific category, I will describe various psychological factors which appear to have affected his personality. In one textbook of psychology, Napoleon is included, together with Joan of Arc, T. Lawrence, I wonder if that's D. Lawrence, and habitual criminals, under the heading of psychopathic personality. This is not an exact diagnosis as much as a descriptive label. And before any reader indignantly dismisses the idea that it can justly be applied to Napoleon, let me quote what Lord Taylor had to say in 1963 at a Congress of the Royal Society of Health. Lord Taylor suggested that psychopaths, mentally disordered people who are abnormally aggressive or irresponsible, burn themselves out by 40. They lose the energy which makes them such a bloody nuisance before 40. Hitler was the king of all psychopaths. In some ways, he was frightfully energetic, but when it came to anything difficult, he was intellectually lazy. Psychopaths are not lazy and scheming. Much of this applies to Napoleon, who himself recognized the decline in his powers, which began just before he was 40. And I have recounted the evidence which led medical experts to deduce that his pituitary gland became burned out at about that time in his life. History has recorded many occasions on which intellectual and physical laziness overcame his restless energy, and bloody nuisance is an understatement of the opinions held of him by millions of good Europeans in his day. As for scheming, Napoleon himself said, "I am crafty," and he could have given points to Machiavelli, the proponent of government by guile or artifice. The psychologist Wilhelm Reich defined Napoleon as a phallic, narcissistic character, which is a type associated with great energy, but also with passive tendencies and an unconscious desire for revenge against the opposite sex. Much of Napoleon's sex life is indeed covered by that definition, and when we remember not only his mighty achievements but the deeds which his enemies called crimes against humanity, and which even his friends have not all agreed to whitewash, it is without surprise that we learn from Reich's teaching that such a character may become a creative genius of a large-scale criminal, depending upon the social atmosphere in which he grows up and the possibilities it provides for an outlet of the energy in a sublimated form. Now, it is not enough to say that Napoleon was a phallic narcissistic type or that he had a psychopathic personality without probing more deeply into psychological mechanisms which could have contributed to this. And the proper place to start is with childhood influences. All psychologists recognize that the early years of childhood are a period of great importance in the formation of character and personality. Alfred Adler believed that an individual's style of life is established in the first 4 or 5 years of his life. In Napoleon's early life, there is much interesting material for our case notes. In the history of a psychiatric case, great importance is attached to the child's place in the family. And if he is not the youngest child, the age at which he was superseded in that position by the next child is often important. There are characteristic features in the psychological makeup of only children, of oldest, and of second children. One might think that there could be no argument about the fact that Napoleon was the second child in his family, but that would be reckoning without the perversity which afflicts so many of his biographers. Several of them have examined the theory that he was really the oldest child, and that his birth certificate was switched with that of Joseph, his elder brother, in order to secure for him a place as a bursar at the military school of Brienne, because he was the son who was clearly destined for the army. He was the first Corsican to be thus educated at the expense of the French king, and had he been Joseph's age, he would have been too old when the application for this privilege was made. Doubts about his real age have been strengthened by the fact that at the time of his marriage to Josephine, he gave his age as 28, though it was really 26. But as Josephine, who was nearly 33, also gave her age as 28, it looks as if they had agreed to conceal the difference in their ages. When Napoleon was a schoolboy of 15, his father discussed his elder brother Joseph's future with him in a manner which suggests that he already felt that Napoleon was the son who could assume the position of head of the family. And when Carlo Bonaparte died less than a year later, that is just what Napoleon did. His strong and determined character led his family to look upon him as its head even at this early age. But despite occasional disagreements, he had considerable respect for Joseph, and with typical Corsican clan spirit often treated him as the rightful head of the family. There is clearly nothing to be gained by disputing the accepted fact that he was the second son, and the historian Norwood Young believed that his character was typical of a second son, who may be impelled to a natural aggressiveness by an unconscious striving to surpass the elder brother. Alfred Adler expresses the second child's position as follows. In later development, the second child is rarely able to endure the strict leadership of others, or to accept the idea of eternal laws. He will be much more inclined to believe, rightly or wrongly, that there is no power in the world which cannot be overthrown. This cap assuredly fits Napoleon. Displacement by a younger child often leads children to be aggressive, disobedient, and domineering, and to adopt unconscious devices to regain the affection of their parents, of which they feel deprived. Napoleon was displaced as the baby of the family by Luciano, later to be called Lucien, at the rather awkward age of 6, too old to accept the new arrival naturally and too young to be encouraged to take it philosophically. It could have been another stimulus to his aggressiveness. Amongst early influences, none is of greater significance than the mother, and the claim of Napoleon's mother to have been a remarkable woman is securely established by a number of biographies, of which two recent ones by Elaine Decaux and Monica Sterling should finally dispel any lingering traces of the once accepted picture of Letizia Buonaparte as a simple peasant woman, barely comprehending the cataclysmic changes in the fortunes of her family and parsimoniously hoarding the money given to her by the emperor against the rainy day. Her claim to have been a good mother to her fantastic family of adventurers with a sprinkling of moral delinquents and psychopaths rests securely on her own claim, fully borne out by her conduct, that the child she loved most was the one who at the time was suffering most. In later life, though she gave to Napoleon the respect which she considered was his due as emperor, she never quite abrogated her own right to exercise authority over her son. She had been described as devoted, unselfish, and tender, yet severe, but this is not the whole story. I intend to show that Napoleon had homosexual tendencies, and in the development of such traits, parental, and especially maternal, influences play a leading part. Madame Mère was certainly not the kind of mother usually thought of as making her sons homosexual. Clinging type who keeps them tied to her apron strings and seeks to entrench herself in their hearts to the exclusion of other, less secure love affairs. Perhaps it was unwise of her to send him to a girls' school when he was the only boy, but she certainly did not make him a mother's boy. Parental influences are a complex study, and without becoming involved in psychiatrists' jargon about Oedipus situations and the child's identification with one or other parent, it is enough to say that Freud found that men are particularly liable to become homosexual if their fathers are weak or absent, and it is the mother who dominates their lives, frustrating and punishing them when necessary in the process of enforcing discipline. This was precisely the situation in the Bonaparte family. Napoleon himself described how his mother did all the punishing while their easygoing father tried to excuse his children's faults. That she was no believer in half measures is illustrated by an incident which, believe it or not, occurred when Napoleon was an artillery lieutenant nearly 18 years old. His grandmother, Signora Fesch, had complained that he and Pauline had imitated her rheumatic gait, with this result in Napoleon's own words: "My mother, though she loved us greatly, would stand no nonsense, and I saw in her eyes that I was in a bad case." Pauline soon received her fate, a petticoat being easier to raise than trousers to unbutton. That evening my mother tried to get hold of me, but without success, and I began to think that I had escaped altogether. Next morning she pushed me away when I approached to kiss her. However, I thought no more of it, when later in the day she said to me, "Napoleon, thou art invited to dine with the governor. Go and dress." I went upstairs very pleased to dine with the officers, but my mother was playing with me as a cat with a mouse. She entered my room suddenly and shut the door. I then saw the trap into which I had fallen, but it was too late, and I had to submit to a spanking. J'ai dû subir le fessée. Napoleon was clearly not the only crafty Bonaparte. Bonaparte, I don't know why he spells it different. I'm sure, obviously, the name evolved, but yeah, why don't you just go with I don't know, maybe that is the correct spelling. After that, one is not surprised that Napoleon said that his mother had a more masculine than a feminine nature, with the head of a man on the body of a woman. Such extraordinary treatment, if it was in any way habitual, could have helped to implant the sadomasochistic tendencies which were apparent in his nature, and also to incline him towards homosexuality. Madame Mère's dislike of Josephine did not spring from the possessive tendencies by which mothers may sometimes incline their sons to homosexuality. She was affronted because her son had not consulted her or the family before getting married. She disapproved of the irregularity of the marriage, of Josephine's extravagance, and her flighty, irresponsible nature. Her dislike was sharpened when she learned of Josephine's infidelity and of the wounding things which she was known to have said about Napoleon's sexual potency. The Bonapartes, united behind the formidable matriarch in relentlessly scheming to separate Napoleon from his wife. Madame Mere's attitude towards the one woman to whom her son professed himself to have been genuinely attached cannot have endeared her to him, but it was characteristic of an uncompromising sternness in her nature, which he himself inherited. Did Napoleon and his mother really love one another? Claude Manseron uncompromisingly says that they did not, and he believes that you could put the whole history of their relationship under a magnifying glass and still not find a trace of tenderness. It was a relationship of mutual and sometimes guarded respect rather than true affection. He always spoke of her with great esteem, but without deep affection, and he seems to have been more fond of his gentle, ineffective father than of his beautiful but stern and unbending mother. Just how unbending she could be is illustrated by a simple little incident of his school days. Napoleon had written a bitter letter complaining that all the other boys had pocket money and he had none. The letter fell into his mother's hands. And although he got his money, it was from her that he received an extremely stern letter about the enormity of demanding money from his father. Carlo Bonaparte could not have written a letter so lacking in tenderness, and would surely have understood what his little son was undergoing in France. Isolated from family and friends, many years later Napoleon would show that he had not forgotten what it was like to be the only boy without pocket money. The Bonaparte family was ruled by a stern matriarch, but it sounds a happy one, and the experience of leaving it when only 9 years old for a distant military school in a strange land must have been a considerable shock. Several biographers have believed that Napoleon was profoundly affected by childhood humiliations and persecution, which he suffered at the hands of well-born young Frenchmen. Whatever may be the truth about this, Napoleon's school days could certainly have provided the breeding ground for feelings of inferiority. Few, if any of us, are quite immune to such feelings, and a few words about their origin may help to explain how Napoleon might have been affected. Alfred Adler can be called the father of the inferiority complex, about which most of us are prepared to talk glibly, if not always with complete understanding. His place in the triumvirate of pioneers, Freud, Jung, and Adler, who charted for us the fascinating territory of man's unconscious mind, was defined by the great Carl Jung when he wrote, Freud began taking sexuality as the only psychic driving power, and only after my break with him did he grant an equal status to other psychic activities as well, whilst Adler has shown convincingly that many cases of neurosis can more satisfactorily be explained on the ground of an urge to power than by the pleasure principle. An urge to power. This may be why I find that Adler is very helpful in one's efforts to understand Napoleon, and his teaching, moreover, is the most easily understood by amateur psychologists, which really means all of us, for Jung said that modern psychology is no more than the testimony of a few individuals here and there regarding what they have found within themselves. Adler taught that all human beings have a deeply rooted desire for dominance or superiority. Our progress towards what he called the goal of superiority is impeded by feelings of inferiority, which have their origin when the small weak child is entirely dependent for its existence upon great and powerful adults. Although many people lose such feelings, a considerable number seize upon any evidence, real or imaginary, of their inferiority and build these feelings into a barrier across the path to the unconscious goal of superiority. The unconscious mind, unwilling to accept the idea of inferiority, can take one or both of two paths around the barrier. One is to concoct excuses for the apparent failure, which often take the form of illness, neurotic or emotional illness. I would have been as good as the others, but for my headaches, my gastric ulcer, and so on. A less negative path is by what is called compensation. the development of some personal quality which can offer or compensate for the feeling of inferiority. This can be a useful process if kept within normal limits, but it can get out of hand. The quality is unconsciously directed to compensate for the inferiority are exaggerated, and the process becomes overcompensation. The meticulously tidy individual with a passion for cleanliness may be overcompensating for behavior of the parvenu. Oh, wait. The meticulously tidy individual with a passion for cleanliness may be overcompensating for deep-seated tendencies in the reverse direction. The ostentatious behavior of the parvenu betrays an inner lack of self-assurance and aggressive masculinity, and the exaggeration of manly qualities may cover an unconfessed awareness of defective masculinity. In Napoleon's case, the only source of inferiority feelings which usually springs to mind is his height. His smallness is almost proverbial, and many psychiatrist jokes play upon it. Small people are often comforted by reminders that the great Napoleon was also small. Shortness is often associated with jealous rivalry, aggressiveness, and a desire for self-assertion. So it has often been said that compensation for his shortness was the chief spur to his ambition. There is, in fact, a good deal of diversity of opinion about his height and general appearance. Officers of the Army and Navy are usually good judges of height and build, but there is little uniformity in the opinions of those who saw Napoleon in captivity. Walter Henry, the Army surgeon, whose report on Napoleon's post-mortem appearance is quoted in Chapter 2, had this to say about his aspect when alive in St. Helena. Napoleon's first appearance was far from imposing. The stature was short and thick, his head sunk into the shoulders, his face fat, with large folds under the chin. The limbs appeared to be stout and well proportioned, complexion olive, expression sinister, forbidding, and rather scowling. Captain Sir Humphrey Senhouse, flag captain to Admiral Sir Henry Hotham, saw a lot of him after his surrender and was equally unflattering. His figure is very bad. He is short, with a large head, his hands and legs small, and his body so corpulent as to project very considerably. He also commented on Napoleon's attitude to women. I could not avoid remarking his sovereign contempt for women. Captain Louis Maitland of Bellerophon was kindlier, and he wrote, he was then a remarkably strong, well-built man, about 5 feet 7 inches high, his limbs particularly well formed, with a fine ankle and very small foot, of which he seemed rather vain, as he always wore, while on board the ship, silk stockings. Bertie Greathead, an English visitor to Paris in 1803, wrote, his person is not only little, but I thought mean. Estimates of his height, ranging from 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 7.5 inches, were the guesses of Captain Henry Meynell of Newcastle, Major General Sir Henry Bunbury, who had the delicate task of informing Napoleon of the decision to send him to St. Helena, and John R. Glover, the Admiral's secretary during the voyage there. Now, of course, from the psychological point of view, Napoleon's corpulence and ungainly appearance, to which he had to adapt himself, as we have seen, from about the age of 36, is of less significance than his height in feet and inches. And here, for once, the matter can be settled without doubt. He was 5 feet 6 inches, as measured by the anatomist Atomachi at the post-mortem examination. He was therefore slightly above the average height for Frenchmen, and only a little less than the average height of our countrymen in his day. The myth that he was a very small man has been perpetuated by the fact that in many English translations of French memoirs, his height is given as about 5 feet 2 inches. This is because of failure to translate French measurements correctly into English ones. It is quite obvious that he did not inevitably convey the impression of being a very small man. As a soldier and as emperor, he effortless, I can't do it, effortlessly dominated the goddamn scene, whether in a court, on the battlefield, or on a parade ground. Messina, one of his most famous marshals, and himself a master of military leadership, said that when Napoleon put on his general's hat, he seemed to be 2 feet higher. He walked among the courtiers and crowned heads of Europe with the assurance, if not always with the graciousness, of one born to the purple. Certainly, there were many occasions when his calm dignity notably deserted him, but although the picture was occasionally that of a being of terrifying malignity, he never for one moment sounds in the least like the familiar figure of the little cock sparrow who overcompensates for his small stature by blustering self-assurance and a bully and aggressive domineering manner. No, we must look deeper if we are to detect possible sources of feelings of inferiority, and I will start with his nationality, which could have affected his character in two distinct ways. Directly, because of the Corsican national characteristics, and indirectly through his own attitude to his Corsican nationality. And I will stop there. There's the rest of that page and that page if you'd like to look at it, but I'm stopping at this juncture. Goodbye for now.